World War II reshaped Germany in ways that no prior crisis, revolution, or political transformation ever had, but perhaps nowhere was its impact more profound than within the intimate sphere of family life. Before the war, the family had been championed by the Nazi regime as the fundamental building block of the nation, idealized in propaganda as a stable, orderly, and racially homogeneous unit governed by clearly defined gender roles and unwavering loyalty to the state. Yet, from 1939 to 1945, and in the tumultuous years that followed, German families experienced upheavals that permanently altered their structure, daily rhythms, relationships, and emotional landscapes. The war's violence seeped into homes, childhoods, marriages, and identities, leaving marks that persisted long after the bombs stopped falling. To understand how German society rebuilt itself in the second half of the 20th century, one must begin by examining how the war fractured, reshaped, and redefined the most basic social institution, the family. The transformation began even before the first shots were fired. Under National Socialism, family life became deeply politicized, infused with ideology, and subject to state intervention in unprecedented ways. The regime sought to mold the German family into an instrument of its racial and social ambitions. Policies promoted large Aryan families, restricted women to domestic roles, and systematically indoctrinated youth through schools and organizations such as the Hitler Youth. While these measures did not immediately destroy traditional family structures, they created tensions and contradictions that would surface dramatically once the war began. The gap between the idyllic family ideal portrayed in propaganda and the realities of everyday life grew wider with each passing year. When war engulfed Europe, the German family became a frontline unit of its own. Mobilization removed millions of men from their households, sending fathers, husbands, and older sons into battle. This sudden absence thrust women into roles that combined domestic responsibility, economic contribution, emotional caregiving, and survival management. Although the Nazi regime had long insisted that women belonged at the hearth, wartime demands forced many into factories, farms, civil defense, or administrative roles. The home front became a zone of constant adaptation, improvisation, and strain. Women navigated rationing, shortages, air raids, evacuation programs, and bureaucratic obstacles, all while preserving whatever fragments of normality they could for their children. For children, the war years constituted an entirely different kind of upheaval. Childhood innocence, already compromised by the ideological reach of Nazi institutions, was further disrupted by fear, displacement, and loss. The air war, perhaps the most direct and devastating assault on civilian life, turned ordinary routines into unpredictable cycles of terror. Nightly sirens, crowded bomb shelters, and the destruction of familiar streets and homes seared unforgettable images into young minds. Many children were evacuated from their cities through the Kinderlandverstreckung program, sent to rural areas or foreign territories for safety. While some experienced kindness and stability, others endured loneliness, neglect, or harsh treatment. As families scattered across Germany and occupied Europe, bonds that once seemed immutable were stretched thin or broken entirely. The war reached its apocalyptic climax in 1944 and 1945, when the collapse of the Eastern Front triggered mass flight, widespread violence, and unprecedented civilian suffering. Families attempting to flee advancing Soviet forces faced freezing temperatures, hunger, disease, and constant bombardment. Those who stayed behind encountered brutal conditions, including widespread assault, looting, and retaliatory violence. In cities such as Berlin, Königsberg, and Breslau, the final months of the war became synonymous with chaos and fear. For countless families, the fall of the Reich was not simply a political event, it was an intimate catastrophe, marked by death, trauma, and irreversible loss. With Germany's surrender, a new and equally challenging era began. The immediate post-war years were characterized by material deprivation, homelessness, food scarcity, and mass displacement. Millions of refugees and expellees from formerly German territories poured into what remained of the country, placing immense pressure on communities and families trying to rebuild. Occupation forces brought new laws, new social dynamics, and new systems of authority that families had to navigate. The return of soldiers, many wounded, traumatized, or changed beyond recognition, introduced further emotional complexities into households already strained by years of absence and hardship. Reunions were often painful rather than joyful, as husbands, wives, and children struggled to reconnect and renegotiate their roles. In both East and West Germany, the Reconstruction period altered family life in different but equally significant ways. In the West, the economic miracle of the 1950s fostered a renewed emphasis on stability, consumer comfort, and the reinvention of the nuclear family. In the East, socialist policies transformed family roles through state-run childcare, full employment for women, and collective forms of support. Yet beneath these new beginnings lay unresolved trauma from the war years. Silence became a defining feature of many households, as parents, particularly fathers, refrained from speaking about their wartime experiences. Children learned early that certain questions caused discomfort or anger, and intergenerational misunderstandings became deeply embedded in family dynamics. Moreover, the reckoning with Nazi crimes, slow, painful, and often resisted, placed further strain on family memory. Children raised in the post-war decades grappled with the realization that their parents or grandparents had participated in or silently accepted the regime's injustices. This generational confrontation reshaped family narratives and, in many cases, fractured identities. The struggle to reconcile affection for one's family with the moral weight of the past became a defining tension for German society throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Despite the devastation, German families also demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. They rebuilt homes from rubble, forged new communities, and produced cultural and social transformations that reshaped Germany's future. Women who had shouldered extraordinary burdens during the war continued to play essential roles in Reconstruction, challenging traditional gender norms. Children who grew up during or just after the war became central to the democratization and modernization of German society, often pushing for transparency, accountability, and change. Yet the war's impact on family life never fully disappeared. It lingered in the silences between generations, in the absences left by those who never returned, in the unspoken traumas carried by survivors, and in the profound cultural memory that shaped German identity. Even today, the legacy of wartime family experiences echoes in personal histories, sociological patterns, and national narratives. The war did not end in 1945 within the walls of the German home. It reverberated through decades of reconstruction, reflection, and remembrance. In the years immediately preceding the outbreak of the Second World War, German family life existed in a paradoxical state, outwardly stable and orderly, yet increasingly shaped by the tightening grip of a totalitarian regime. The Nazi rise to power in 1933 had set into motion a series of far-reaching social, economic, and ideological transformations that reverberated through every household in the Third Reich. By 1939, the private sphere of the German home was no longer a refuge from politics. Rather, it had become a stage upon which the state projected its ambitions, expectations, and demands. Understanding how German families lived before the storm of global conflict descended, how they worked, loved, raised children, and navigated daily life offers crucial insight into the profound upheavals that war would soon unleash. For many families, the early and mid-1930s were marked by a sense of economic relief. The Great Depression had devastated Germany, leaving millions unemployed and families desperate. When Hitler's government launched massive public works projects, expanded the military, and suppressed labor strikes, employment rose sharply. In countless households, these developments brought immediate improvements. Fathers found work, income stabilized, and the nightly dinner table felt less burdened by fear of hunger or eviction. This material improvement created a complex foundation for German family life, one in which genuine gratitude coexisted with growing coercion. Many parents believed the regime had saved their family, even as new constraints invaded their private decisions, shaping their children's education, their work roles, and their expectations for the future. Traditional gender roles were reinforced through Nazi ideology. Mothers were celebrated as the symbolic heart of the nation, tasked with nurturing strong, racially pure children. The regime's maternal ideal, part sentimental, part propagandistic, emphasized fertility, homemaking, and obedience. Awards such as the Mother's Cross were bestowed upon women with large families, turning reproduction into a patriotic duty. In countless homes, this ideal reshaped daily routines. Women, even those with ambitions beyond the domestic sphere, often found themselves encouraged or pressured to withdraw from the workforce and embrace full-time motherhood. State welfare programs, marriage loans, and financial incentives further nudged families toward a traditional model designed to strengthen the Volk. Yet beneath the surface of this promoted ideal lay a more complex reality. Not all families conformed, nor could they. Urban working-class households, reliant on two incomes, could not easily afford for women to remain at home. Many women continued to work as clerks, nurses, teachers, or factory workers, even as Nazi policies subtly but steadily restricted their opportunities for advancement. Meanwhile, ideological expectations clashed with lived experience. Families with few children were sometimes viewed as insufficiently committed to the nation, while infertile couples faced intrusive medical scrutiny. The regime's racial laws further fractured the meaning of family, especially for Jewish Germans, whose lives were increasingly destabilized through discrimination, segregation, and violence. For countless Jewish families, the pre-war years were a time of growing fear, uncertainty, and forced adaptation, as their rights were stripped away, their jobs threatened, and their very belonging questioned. For children, life in pre-war Germany was steeped in propaganda. Schools emphasized obedience, racial ideology, and reverence for the Führer. Classrooms displayed swastikas and portraits of the Führer, while textbooks glorified war, nationalism, and Aryan superiority. Many subjects, science, history, physical education, were redesigned to reflect Nazi aims. Yet the school environment was only one part of a broader effort to shape young minds. Youth organizations such as the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls became nearly universal experiences. Through camping trips, drills, songs, and communal activities, children learned discipline, loyalty, and martial enthusiasm. Membership, which became mandatory in 1936, effectively tethered the next generation to the ideology of the regime, instilling values that would shape their perception of family life, duty, and identity. Inside the home, these influences often created tension between parents and children. Some parents quietly resented the intrusion of the Hitler Youth, especially as its activities became increasingly time-consuming and militaristic. Others welcomed it, believing it provided structure and community. Children, however, often found themselves navigating two worlds: the world of parental authority and affection, and the world of state-driven ideology that demanded unwavering loyalty. In some cases, the regime's influence strained relationships, as children reported parents for anti-Nazi remarks or embraced beliefs their families privately rejected. Thus, even before the war began, the regime had already planted seeds of fragmentation within the German household. Daily life in German cities and towns before 1939 varied widely depending on geography, class, and political background. In rural areas, family life retained a degree of continuity. Farms relied on traditional divisions of labor, with men performing physically demanding tasks and women managing household and garden duties. The Nazi emphasis on agrarian purity and rural vitality bolstered the cultural prestige of village families, although in practice, rural hardships remained significant. Meanwhile, urban middle-class families experience a mixture of conformity and quiet ambivalence. Many enjoyed newfound stability, but they also witnessed the increasing militarization of society, the disappearance of Jewish neighbors, and the normalization of propaganda. Some supported the regime wholeheartedly, others complied outwardly while privately harboring unease. For families deemed undesirable by the Nazi state, Jews, Roma and Sinti, political dissidents, people with disabilities, the pre-war years were defined by escalating persecution. Anti-Jewish legislation restricted employment, education, and property ownership. Children faced bullying at school, businesses lost customers, and social circles narrowed under fear. Many families debated emigration, though opportunities were limited. Those who remained often lived under constant threat, their domestic lives overshadowed by uncertainty and dread. For these families, life before the war was not a period of stability, but one of mounting crisis. Leisure and culture also reflected the duality of the period. Families attended cinema screenings, where newsreels glorified the regime. Radio, a centerpiece for many homes, broadcast speeches, music, and propaganda, becoming both a unifying and indoctrinating presence. Yet despite the ideological messaging, many families sought to carve out private moments of normalcy: Sunday walks, shared meals, celebrations of birthdays and holidays. These rituals allowed families to maintain a sense of continuity, even as the regime encroached upon the private sphere. The home became a contested space where ordinary life persisted alongside political intrusion. By the late 1930s, the German state's mobilization for war began to reshape family life more directly. Conscription expanded, drawing men into the military. Economic policies shifted toward rearmament, creating shortages of non-essential goods and increasing demands on workers. Air raid preparations were introduced, and families received instructions on blackout procedures and emergency readiness. Though the full scale of the coming conflict was not yet clear, the atmosphere grew tense and militarized. Fathers prepared to leave, mothers anticipated new responsibilities, and children sensed the anxiety of the adults around them. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the German family entered a new and irreversible phase of transformation. What had previously been an atmosphere of tense expectation became the lived reality of total war. Mobilization reshaped not only the battlefield, but also the daily rhythms, emotional bonds, and internal structure of every German household. With fathers, sons, uncles, and brothers drafted into the Wehrmacht, the family unit, long upheld as a central pillar of the Nazi vision, was abruptly split apart. The separation marked the beginning of profound changes in roles, responsibilities, and psychological landscapes that would intensify as the conflict deepened. In the earliest months of the war, many German families experienced a strange mixture of anxiety and optimism. Memories of rapid victories in 1939 and 1940 gave rise to a belief that the conflict would be short, decisive, and favorable to Germany. Fathers left home believing they would return within months. They posed for photographs in uniform before departing, wrote letters filled with confident reassurances, and tried to ease the fears of wives and children. In kitchens and living rooms across the Reich, mothers attempted to maintain an aura of normalcy. Yet beneath the patriotic rhetoric lay a simmering dread. one sharpened by the memory of the First World War, which had scarred an entire generation of parents and grandparents. As the war expanded, mobilization intensified. Millions of men were called to the front, leaving households led predominantly by women, the elderly, and adolescents. The absence of fathers dramatically reshaped family life. Husbands who had once been the primary breadwinners and authority figures were now remote presences, their influence reduced to letters from distant battlefields. The postal service became a lifeline. Families gathered around the kitchen table to read each new envelope, searching for signs of safety, health, and emotional connection. These letters carried immense weight, often preserved as treasured artifacts of hope. But they also revealed the emotional strain on soldiers, many of whom concealed their fear and exhaustion to protect their families from worry. With men gone, the burden of survival shifted squarely onto the women left behind. Mothers became heads of household, responsible for finances, child care, ration management, and increasingly, participation in the labor force. While Nazi ideology had glorified women as homemakers and mothers, the demands of total war forced a contradiction in state policy. The regime that had discouraged or restricted female employment now relied heavily on women to maintain production, fill workforce shortages, and keep the nation functioning. Women worked in factories, offices, hospitals, transport services, agriculture, and civil defense operations. Their days became a relentless cycle of labor, queues, and domestic responsibilities, leaving little time for rest or emotional recuperation. Children experienced the mobilization in deeply personal ways. Some felt pride in their father's uniforms, others felt abandoned or fearful. Bedtime routines were disrupted, discipline patterns changed, and emotional bonds shifted. Older children assumed new responsibilities, helping with chores, caring for younger siblings, or assisting in farms and factories. The absence of fathers created a vacuum of authority that mothers struggled to fill amid exhaustion, scarcity, and constant stress. The roles within the family subtly reconfigured as children matured prematurely, and mothers developed survival strategies shaped by resilience and necessity. Psychologically, separation took a heavy toll. Many women endured sleepless nights, torn between fear for their husbands and the need to appear strong for their children. Social expectations demanded stoicism. Communities often stigmatized expressions of fear, doubt, or grief. Propaganda posters, radio broadcasts, and women's magazines urged wives to maintain cheerful households, uphold morale, and embody the ideal of the steadfast German mother. Yet behind closed doors, anxiety simmered. Every knock at the door could signal the arrival of a telegram, a catastrophic message that shattered families with a few words. "We regret to inform you." Telegrams became the most feared objects in the German home. The arrival of a uniformed official bearing news of injury, capture, or death could instantly plunge a household into despair. Widows navigated not only grief, but also bureaucratic hurdles, financial instability, and the challenge of raising children alone. While formal support structures such as widows' pensions or party-sponsored welfare organizations, the emotional and practical burden remained immense. Communities often stepped in, offering childcare, food, or emotional support, but the scale of loss meant many families felt isolated in their sorrow. Families also faced strains from the shifting moral terrain of wartime. Long separations gave rise to difficulties in marital fidelity, loneliness, and emotional distance. While some marriages deepened through shared suffering, others fractured. Soldiers returning on brief leave sometimes found households transformed, with children who barely recognized them, and wives hardened by exhaustion. The emotional gap between frontline experience and home front life widened as the war progressed, creating barriers of understanding that strained even close-knit families. Material conditions worsened steadily after 1941. Rationing expanded to include meat, dairy, clothing, and household goods. Queues outside shops became an unavoidable part of life. Mothers became experts in improvising, stretching limited ingredients, repurposing worn clothing, and fixing broken items. Children grew up learning to make do with less, developing a sense of frugality and caution that would shape their post-war identities. Winters were particularly harsh, with shortages of fuel forcing families to huddle in cold rooms, often wearing coats indoors and rationing firewood with strict precision. Air raid alerts introduced a new dimension of fear. Fathers far away could not protect their families from the nightly wail of sirens, the rush to shelters, or the explosive terror of falling bombs. Children often clung to their mothers in dark cellars, listening to the earth-shaking rumble of destruction overhead. These experiences bonded families in trauma, while also intensifying their emotional exhaustion. Women carried the additional weight of protecting their children from both physical danger and psychological distress, tasks that fathers might have once shared. Communication with soldiers became increasingly strained as the war expanded. Letters arrived less frequently, news from the front became grim. Some families endured months of silence, unsure if their loved ones were alive. Others received cryptic notices of missing soldiers, a limbo that left families unsure how to mourn or hope. Many soldiers, sensing their likely fate, began writing farewell letters, confessions of love, instructions for family affairs, or emotional reflections meant to be opened only if they did not return. These letters, hidden in drawers or preserved in boxes, became sacred relics in post-war domestic life. By 1943, total mobilization reached its peak. The regime demanded everything from its citizens: labor, loyalty, sacrifice. The home front was effectively militarized. Women participated in anti-aircraft crews, civil defense services, and auxiliary roles in the military. Elderly parents became crucial caregivers. Children engaged in wartime activities through schools and youth organizations. As the Second World War intensified, German women found themselves at the center of a profound social transformation. What began as temporary adjustments to male absence quickly evolved into a sweeping redefinition of gender roles, labor patterns, and family responsibilities. The Nazi regime, which had spent years glorifying women as homemakers and mothers, now depended on them to keep the nation functioning amid shortages, bombings, and rising casualties. This contradiction between ideology and necessity shaped the everyday lives of millions of women, mothers, daughters, widows, and workers who struggled to maintain stability while carrying the full weight of the home front. The most immediate change came from the departure of men. Fathers, husbands, brothers, and adult sons were drafted in massive numbers, leaving women to assume roles they had never anticipated. Many households transitioned overnight from traditional family structures to female-led units. Women became financial managers, disciplinarians, providers, and protectors. Their days grew longer and more complex, marked by a constant balancing act between domestic duties and increasing demands for labor outside the home. Despite the regime's continued rhetoric about women belonging in the household, necessity pushed women into workplaces that had previously been male-dominated. Labor shortages intensified as the war expanded. Factories manufacturing weapons, uniforms, vehicles, and supplies required a workforce capable of sustaining non-stop production. Women filled these roles in growing numbers, often taking on physically demanding and repetitive tasks. They worked in munitions plants, chemical factories, steel production lines, transportation services, and agricultural fields. While some women found empowerment or pride in contributing to the war effort, many entered these roles reluctantly, compelled by economic pressure or state mandates. Work days were long and exhausting, made more demanding by constant rationing and the emotional strain of separation from loved ones. In urban settings, women's work was heavily influenced by the rhythms of war. Air raid alarms could interrupt shifts at any moment, sending workers hurrying toward shelters. Destruction of infrastructure forced factories to relocate or operate under hazardous conditions. Nevertheless, production expectations remained high. Women often left work covered in soot, dust, or chemical residue, only to return home to manage cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Their dual workload, professional and domestic, formed a relentless cycle that left little room for rest. This exhaustion became a defining feature of life on the home front. Agricultural labor presented its own challenges. As men left farms for military service, women and teenage children took on the heavy tasks of planting, harvesting, and maintaining livestock. The regime's propaganda praised these women as the backbone of rural Germany, emphasizing their role in sustaining food supplies. Yet material shortages, fuel rationing, and limited equipment made agricultural work increasingly difficult. Rural women developed improvisational strategies to manage with what little they had, often working from dawn until dusk to meet quotas. Seasonal laborers, prisoners of war, and forced laborers were brought in to fill gaps, adding new layers of complexity and tension to daily farm life. Beyond formal labor, women bore the responsibility of navigating an increasingly strained domestic economy. Rationing dictated almost every aspect of household management. Flour, butter, meat, sugar, clothing, and fuel were distributed in strict, limited quantities. Women spent hours in queues, carried ration books everywhere, and often had to visit multiple shops to gather enough for their families. Creativity became essential. Women learned to stretch ingredients, substitute scarce items, mend worn-out clothes, and reuse household materials in ways they would never have imagined before the war. This constant improvisation required remarkable ingenuity and patience. Childcare became even greater challenge. With fathers absent and mothers working long hours, children were frequently left in the care of grandparents, neighbors, or older siblings. Schools operating under strain often held irregular hours due to air raids or resource shortages. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls absorbed many children's time, providing structured activities but also increasing the influence of Nazi ideology within the household. Mothers worried about their children's physical safety, emotional well-being, and moral development. Many struggled to maintain the warmth of family life amid relentless pressure. Communal support structures emerged as crucial lifelines. Neighborhood networks formed, with women sharing childcare, food, tools, and encouragement. Apartment buildings and village streets became hubs of solidarity, where women exchanged advice on cooking with limited ingredients or sewing patches onto threadbare garments. These bonds provided emotional sustenance, helping women endure the hardships of war. Yet social pressures also intensified. Women were expected to project strength, patriotism, and resilience. Showing fear, fatigue, or doubt could lead to judgment from neighbors or scrutiny from authorities. The Nazi regime attempted to harness women's labor and emotional resilience through propaganda and policy. Posters depicted idealized images of strong, hard-working mothers contributing to victory. Magazines urged women to remain cheerful and supportive, even as bombs fell and letters from the front grew ominous. Organizations such as the National Socialist Women's League, or NS-Frauschaft, and the German Red Cross mobilized women for community services, including assisting in hospitals, shelters, and relief efforts. Some women embraced these roles enthusiastically, finding purpose in collective action. Others participated out of necessity or pressure. Air raids brought the responsibilities of women into sharp focus. As cities became targets of Allied bombing, mothers became the first line of defense for their children. They learned to interpret the sound of approaching aircraft, guide children to shelters, and comfort them during explosions. Shelters were often overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and frightening. Mothers shielded their children physically and emotionally, offering reassurance despite their own fear. When families emerged after raids, it was often the women who assessed damage, salvaged belongings, and decided how to rebuild daily routines. The psychological toll of these responsibilities was immense. Women lived in a state of persistent anxiety, worried for their husbands at the front, their children during air raids, and their own ability to maintain stability. Letters from soldiers sometimes provided comfort, but they could also heighten emotional strain, revealing the horrors of combat or the despair of prolonged separation. Many women avoided discussing their true feelings, believing they needed to appear strong for their children. Emotional repression became a survival mechanism, but it also deepened feelings of loneliness and isolation. The moral and social pressures of wartime life created dilemmas. Shortages tempted some women to participate in black markets or barter networks, trading valuables for scarce food or supplies. From the moment Hitler rose to power in 1933, children became a central focus of the regime's long-term vision. By the time World War II erupted, the state had already reshaped the very concept of childhood in Germany. Schools, youth organizations, cultural programs, and even leisure activities were all restructured to mold children into loyal, obedient, and ideologically aligned citizens of the Reich. For millions of young people, the war years were marked by a combination of indoctrination, fear, forced maturity, and emotional fragmentation. Their experiences, shaped by propaganda, separation, violence, and instability, left enduring marks that would follow them throughout their lives. In the early pre-war years, education was transformed fundamentally. Classrooms no longer served simply as spaces for academic learning, but as sites for political conditioning. Textbooks were rewritten to promote racial ideology, militaristic values, and reverence for the Führer. History lessons glorified German victories, biology classes emphasized racial theories, and geography lessons highlighted territorial ambitions. Teachers, many of whom had joined the Nazi Party or were pressured to comply, reinforced these messages. Children learned from a young age that obedience, discipline, and physical strength were more important than intellectual curiosity or critical thinking. The Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, and the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, formed the backbone of the regime's youth control. By 1936, membership was compulsory, making participation nearly universal. Boys were trained for future military service, exposed to drills, camping expeditions, and ideological lessons centered around sacrifice, heroism, and loyalty. The Hitler Youth emphasized endurance and discipline, preparing boys physically and psychologically for the eventuality of war. Girls, meanwhile, were groomed for motherhood and community roles, instructed in domestic skills, racial purity doctrines, and social service. The organization structured nearly every aspect of children's free time, leaving little room for independent thought or family influence. When the war began in 1939, these systems intensified. Youth leaders, some barely adults themselves, became extensions of the Nazi state. They supervised activities, enforced expectations, and reported any perceived dissent. Children were encouraged to view Hitler Youth leaders as role models, sometimes even more trustworthy than their own parents. This created rifts within families. Some children became ardent believers in Nazi ideology, challenging or contradicting their parents' private doubts. Others complied outwardly while privately resenting the pressure. The psychological impact was profound. Childhood innocence became intertwined with politics, loyalty tests, and moral confusion. Daily life for children grew increasingly unstable as the war progressed. Fathers left for the front, and mothers took on grueling workloads. Many children felt the emotional vacuum created by parental absence. They matured quickly, taking on household chores, caring for younger siblings, or assisting elderly relatives. Their emotional needs were often overshadowed by the practical demands of wartime survival. The state filled this gap with propaganda, urging children to be brave, loyal, and self-sacrificing. Posters and stories glorified young heroes who aided soldiers or defended the homeland, pressuring children to align their identity with wartime ideals. Fear became a defining feature of childhood during the war. Air raid sirens pierced the nights, forcing families into shelters where darkness, crowding, and the sound of explosions created lasting trauma. Children clung to their mothers or older siblings, uncertain whether their homes or their loved ones would still exist upon returning to the surface. Bombings disrupted schools, destroyed neighborhoods, and killed classmates and teachers. Some children witnessed devastating scenes that no child should ever see: burning buildings, wounded civilians, ruined streets, or the bodies of neighbors and friends. These experiences etched deep emotional scars. Evacuation programs known as the Kinderlandverschickung relocated millions of children from cities to rural areas to protect them from bombing raids. While some found safety and kindness in their host families, many others experienced loneliness, homesickness, or neglect. Siblings were often separated, further fragmenting family bonds. Children struggled to adjust to unfamiliar environments, strict routines, and long periods without parental contact. Letters became lifelines, though delivery delays heightened anxiety. Some children returned home changed, older in spirit, more cautious, and carrying memories of displacement that lingered into adulthood. The war also eroded the boundaries between childhood and active participation in the conflict. As boys grew older, many were integrated into anti-aircraft units or assigned to assist with civil defense. Teenagers were trained to handle weapons, spot aircraft, and perform dangerous tasks typically reserved for adults. The regime portrayed these responsibilities as honors, marking boys as defenders of the Reich. Yet the reality was far more perilous. Many youth members were killed or injured, their lives shut short by the very ideology that claimed to protect them. By the final years of the war, the desperation of the crumbling Third Reich pushed children even further into direct involvement. 15- and 16-year-olds were drafted into the Volkssturm, the home defense militia. Barely trained and poorly equipped, these teenagers were expected to fight seasoned Allied forces. The image of children in oversized uniforms clutching outdated rifles came to symbolize the tragic collapse of the regime. Parents, already exhausted by years of war, watched in terror as their sons were sent to frontline positions from which many never returned. Meanwhile, girls faced their own dangers. As the front approached German territory, evacuation routes filled with refugees fleeing violence, hunger, and advancing armies. Girls helped their families carry belongings, tend to younger children, or search for missing relatives. They were exposed to chaos, fear, and, in many tragic cases, the threat of assault during the final months of the conflict. The psychological weight of these experiences profoundly shaped their transition to adulthood. By the middle years of World War II, the German home front had become a battleground of its own. What had begun as a distant conflict, fought in foreign territories and framed by propaganda as a series of swift victories, gradually crept into the heart of everyday civilian life. The stability that once defined German family life fractured as Allied bombing raids intensified, cities transformed into ruins, and households became scattered across the country. For millions of families, the war brought not only physical destruction, but emotional devastation, grief, persistent uncertainty, and a profound dislocation of identity and belonging. The air war over Germany emerged as one of the most catastrophic fronts of the conflict. Allied strategic bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers, transportation networks, military sites, and eventually entire urban districts. Cities such as Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, Essen, and many others became synonymous with devastation. For German civilians, the sound of the air raid siren became an almost daily reality, a chilling indicator that danger was approaching from the sky. Families were forced to abandon meals, homework, or evening routines to flee into shelters or cellars, often with only minutes to spare. Inside these dark, overcrowded spaces, fear took on a life of its own. Children clung to parents or siblings. Mothers attempted to maintain calm even as the ground trembled above them. The thunder of bombs, the crack of collapsing buildings, and the heavy, suffocating air filled with dust and sweat created a sensory experience that many survivors would never forget. Time lost meaning during these raids. Minutes felt like hours, and each explosion carried the possibility that home, school, or neighborhood would no longer exist by the time the family emerged. When the all-clear signal finally sounded, families confronted scenes that were both surreal and heartbreaking. Entire streets lay flattened, flames lit the night sky, and rescue workers searched through debris for survivors. Many families returned to find their homes reduced to rubble, their belongings buried or burned beyond recognition. Photographs, heirlooms, letters, and childhood artifacts, objects that held the memories and continuity of family life, were often lost forever. The destruction of these homes symbolized more than property loss. It represented the erasure of personal histories and the disintegration of the emotional anchors that families relied upon for stability. Displacement became an unavoidable consequence of the bombings. Millions of Germans were forced to relocate, sometimes multiple times, as their cities became uninhabitable. Families were separated when fathers remained at the front, mothers were evacuated with children, and elderly relatives refused or were unable to move. For many, displacement meant living in overcrowded rural dwellings, temporary barracks, or with distant relatives and strangers. Privacy vanished, routines dissolved, and identities rooted in community and neighborhood life were disrupted. This fragmentation strained relationships and created emotional distance that lingered long after the war. Children, in particular, experienced displacement in ways that reshaped their understanding of home and safety. Some had already been evacuated through programs such as the Kinderlandverschickung, while others fled with their families as bombs destroyed their neighborhoods. Constant relocation meant new schools, unfamiliar faces, and a sense of being perpetual outsiders. Many children lived with the fear that they might never see their homes or friends again, an anxiety compounded by the uncertainty surrounding fathers serving on the front lines. Their drawings, diaries, and later testimonies reveal a consistent theme. The war fractured the very concept of childhood security. For mothers, the challenges of displacement were overwhelming. With husbands absent or unreachable, they shouldered the responsibility of protecting their children, securing food, managing bureaucratic demands, and navigating the chaos of destroyed infrastructure. Their roles expanded not by choice, but by necessity. Emotional exhaustion set in as they balanced fear for their families, grief for lost loved ones, and the constant pressure to maintain some semblance of normal life. Women recounted sleepless nights spent listening for sirens, days spent queuing for scarce supplies, and moments of anguish when learning of deaths or disappearances. Despite this, many found inner strength, forming support networks that helped communities survive. As the war dragged on, food shortages worsened dramatically. Rationing became stricter, agricultural production declined, and transportation disruptions hindered distribution. Families endured long lines for meager supplies, and creative substitutions became common in daily meals. Bread was stretched with fillers, ersatz coffee replaced real beans, and sugar became a rare luxury. Malnutrition affected children most severely, weakening their health and leaving long-term consequences on development. Elderly family members, often among the most vulnerable, suffered greatly as well. By 1944, the war that many Germans had once believed would bring national glory had unraveled into a catastrophe engulfing every aspect of daily life. The Eastern Front had collapsed, cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and families were already fractured by years of loss and separation. But the final phase of the war, and the chaotic aftermath that followed, would bring an even deeper rupture. Germany's defeat was not simply a military collapse, it was a profound moral, psychological, and social reckoning that reshaped German family life for generations. The final months of the conflict were marked by terror, uncertainty, and a sense of inevitable doom. As Allied forces pushed toward Germany from all sides, civilians found themselves caught between collapsing military fronts and the escalating brutality of the regime itself. Propaganda emphasized heroic last stands and demanded total obedience, even as the situation grew hopeless. Many families felt trapped, unable to flee, unable to resist, and unable to protect themselves from the violence that engulfed the collapsing Reich. The advance of the Red Army into East German territories triggered mass panic. Stories, some exaggerated, others tragically accurate, circulated about atrocities committed during the Soviet advance. Families fled in chaotic caravans of carts, bicycles, and makeshift wagons, joining millions of refugees on roads clogged with desperate people. Mothers carried infants as older children trudged beside them, hungry and exhausted. Many froze to death during the brutal winter of 1944-45. Others drowned when evacuation ships were sunk or were killed by advancing military forces. For countless families, this exodus marked the most traumatic experience of the war. Those unable or unwilling to flee endured the direct violence of occupation. In the East, rape, looting, and executions were widespread. The experience left deep scars on families, particularly women and girls, who carried the trauma silently for decades. The shame and silence surrounding these events created emotional fissures that reverberated across generations. Husbands returning from the front were often unaware of what their families had endured, and many women felt unable to disclose their experiences for fear of judgment, disbelief, or emotional collapse. In the final days of the war, chaos consumed urban centers. Hitler Youth boys, elderly men, and untrained civilians were pressed into the Volkssturm, the desperate final militia created to defend the collapsing regime. This meant that some families saw their sons, mere teenagers, sent to fight against overwhelming Allied forces. Many never returned. For mothers, watching their children forced into hopeless battles was among the war's most agonizing moments. With Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, families faced a new and unfamiliar reality: foreign occupation. American, British, French, and Soviet troops divided the country into zones, each with its own policies and approach to reconstruction. For German families, occupation meant confronting not only material scarcity, but also the legacy of the Nazi regime, the meaning of defeat, and the moral reckoning of crimes committed in their name. In the first months after the surrender, food shortages reached critical levels. Infrastructure was destroyed, factories were idle, and agricultural production had collapsed. Families survived on meager rations, often resorting to bartering or scavenging to supplement their diets. Children suffered from malnutrition, and mothers struggled to find enough to feed them. Allied aid helped stabilize conditions, but for many, hunger remained a constant companion well into the late 1940s. Housing shortages added another layer of hardship. Millions of homes had been destroyed by bombing, and millions more were overcrowded with displaced persons, returning soldiers, and refugees from the East. Families who once enjoyed private apartments found themselves sharing cramped spaces with strangers. Privacy disappeared, and tensions often ran high. These live-in conditions placed immense strain on relationships and hindered efforts to rebuild emotional stability. The return of soldiers from the front brought its own complications. Some came home physically wounded or psychologically shattered. Others had spent years as prisoners of war, returning only long after the conflict had ended. Children sometimes failed to recognize fathers they had last seen as toddlers. Reunification was often awkward and emotionally fraught. Husbands struggled to understand the hardships their families had endured. Wives, who had shouldered the burdens of survival alone, were often reluctant to relinquish their new independence. These tensions contributed to rising divorce rates and long-term fractures within families. Occupation brought not only social challenges but also a political reckoning. Denazification programs, though inconsistent across zones, required Germans to confront their connections to the Nazi regime. Former party members were removed from public office, teachers were dismissed, and individuals were interrogated about their past affiliations. This created deep anxieties within families. Parents feared how their pasts might affect their children's futures. Children struggled to reconcile their love for their parents with the growing public condemnation of Nazism. Many young people felt betrayed, realizing that the ideology they had been taught since childhood was now condemned as criminal and immoral. For teenagers who had grown up in the Hitler Youth, defeat triggered an existential crisis. The collapse of the Reich meant the collapse of the worldview that had shaped their identities. Many experienced profound guilt, confusion, or anger. Some rejected everything associated with the past. Others clung stubbornly to discredited beliefs. Families navigated these generational tensions cautiously, often avoiding discussions of guilt, complicity, or ideology altogether. Occupation brought interactions with Allied soldiers, sometimes friendly, sometimes strained. In the Western zones, American and British forces often showed more leniency, leading to exchanges that ranged from cautious cooperation to romantic relationships. These relationships were controversial. Many women who entered them faced social stigma or accusations of betrayal. Children born from such unions, later called occupation children, often faced discrimination and identity struggles. In the Soviet zone, interactions between civilians and occupying forces were far more controlled and often marked by fear. Political repression, property seizures, and strict oversight shaped daily life. Families learned to navigate a new landscape of ideological tension, where one totalitarian system had been replaced by another emerging one. The division between East and West would soon solidify, further fracturing families who found themselves separated by borders, politics, and incompatible social systems. In 1945, when the Third Reich collapsed, German families stood amid physical ruins and emotional devastation. The war had not merely destroyed cities and infrastructure, it had dismantled identities, fractured relationships, and reshaped the very structure of everyday life. As the nation transitioned from dictatorship and defeat into occupation and reconstruction, families faced the enormous task of rebuilding their lives while confronting, or avoiding, the weight of the past. The post-war era marked both a beginning and a reckoning, one that would influence German family life for decades to come. The immediate post-war period was dominated by the struggle for survival. Families contended with acute shortages of food, clothing, and housing. Bombed-out cities resembled ghostly landscapes, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Many families lived in makeshift shelters, cellars, or overcrowded apartments, shared with strangers and refugees. Rationing continued, and the black market became an essential means of obtaining basic goods. Children scavenged for firewood or scrap metal. Mothers queued for hours to secure bread or potatoes. For many, this austere period, lasting until the currency reform of 1948, was remembered as being even harder than the final months of the war. Reconstruction required labor on a massive scale. Women, already experienced in managing wartime households, again took a leading role. As Trümmerfrauen, the women who cleared rubble, Thousands worked in teams, removing debris by hand, salvaging bricks, and helping reopen streets and public spaces. Their efforts symbolized resilience and civic spirit. Yet behind this image lay deep emotional fatigue. Many women carried the burden of trauma, widowhood, and the challenge of raising children alone. Others navigated the complexities of reunification when husbands returned after years as prisoners of war. These reunions were often tense and emotionally fraught, marked by changed identities, unspoken suffering, and mismatched expectations. Fathers returning home often struggled to reintegrate into family life. They re-entered households where children had grown up without them, sometimes forming stronger attachments to mothers or grandparents. Boys who had been partially shaped by Hitler Youth ideals often found their father's authority weakened or irrelevant. Meanwhile, many men wrestled with guilt, shame, or psychological scars from combat and captivity. Silence became a survival strategy. Families rarely discussed the war, and children learned early that certain questions should not be asked. This culture of silence would shape generational dynamics for decades to come. The post-war years also brought significant social restructuring. The introduction of new political systems, democracy in the West and socialism in the East, transformed everyday life. In West Germany, the Basic Law, 1949, established protections for family life, gender equality, and civil rights. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle of the 1950s, brought rising living standards, consumer goods, and a shift toward nuclear family ideals as families moved into new apartments, purchased modern appliances, and embraced a culture of stability and order as a reprieve from the turmoil of the previous years. Yet beneath this apparent stability lay unresolved trauma. Many children who had witnessed bombings, displacement, or violence grew into adults shaped by anxiety, emotional restraint, or difficulty expressing vulnerability. Psychological research later revealed widespread symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress, though such concepts were not widely understood at the time. Parents, shaped by wartime stoicism, often responded to emotional distress with sternness or detachment. This intergenerational transmission of trauma created patterns that only later generations could fully articulate. In East Germany, the socialist state imposed a different model of family life. The government emphasized collective responsibility, female employment, and state-run childcare. Many families experienced a greater degree of social stability, housing assistance, and community support than in the immediate post-war West. However, political repression, surveillance, and ideological control imposed their own strains on family dynamics. Silence, again, became a protective habit. Across both German states, the question of guilt and responsibility for Nazi crimes lingered as an unspoken tension. For many families, confronting the past meant confronting the roles played by parents and grandparents, a deeply painful and often avoided topic. Public reckoning was slow, and private conversations even slower. Children of the 1950s and 1960s grew up sensing contradictions. Pride in reconstruction and prosperity coexisted with whispered memories of war and collective denial of atrocities. It was not until the student movements of the late 1960s that younger generations demanded transparency and accountability, challenging both the state and their parents. Despite these tensions, the decades after the war marked a period of profound transformation. Families rebuilt homes, nurtured children, and cultivated a future that felt radically different from the authoritarian, militarized world of the Third Reich. Education reforms emphasized critical thinking and democratic values. Cultural shifts placed greater emphasis on emotional well-being, open communication, and equality within the household. Divorce rates rose, women's rights expanded, and youth culture flourished. German society and the families within it slowly moved toward modernity. Yet the long shadow of the war never fully disappeared. Memories persisted in fragments, in old photographs saved from rubble, in stories told cautiously at dinner tables, in the silence of parents who could not speak about their pasts. Many children sensed the emotional voids left by trauma without fully understanding them. Some grew up to investigate family histories, uncovering stories of survival, complicity, or victimhood only decades later. These discoveries reshaped their understanding not only of national history, but of their own identities.